Sejam bem-vindos novamente, obrigado pela presença. Em nome da SP-Arte da Arte Brasileiros, eu agradeço a presença de todos a mais um ciclo Arte e Mercado, hoje com o tema Talks Coleções na América. Agradeço em especial o apoio da Montblanc neste evento. Peço, por gentileza, que desliguem os seus celulares para nós não termos interferência na sonorização. E informo que as perguntas aos palestrantes serão feitas através dos microfones que estão com as nossas recepcionistas. Daremos início agora ao painel Artistas e Curadores. Chamo ao palco Joan Weinstein, do Getting Foundation. Por gentileza.
Thank you so much. Before I start, I'd like to thank Arte Brasileiros and SP-Arte for the opportunity to come here. I'm basically going to tell all of you why you have to come to Los Angeles in September of 2017, or in the 4 months that follow. And it is for a project that is called Pacific Standard Time, LA. Before I can really tell you about it, I need to tell you about the first Pacific Standard Time, which debuted in 2010 and was called Art in LA, 1945 to 1980. And it was a project that was 10 years in the making. This project began with the modest ambition of rescuing the archive of the history of Los Angeles art in the post-war period, and grew into a huge public initiative that eventually resulted in 68 exhibitions throughout Southern California, basically at the same time, a performance art festival, 70 galleries participating with more than 100 exhibitions, and a huge marketing campaign to attract audiences to Southern California. And I want to acknowledge my co-director in the first Pacific Standard Time, Andrew Perchuk, who's here with us today from the Getty Research Institute. All this was made possible by grants from the Getty Foundation, which most importantly funded 2 years of research and planning by all the museums in Southern California so that could put on new groundbreaking exhibitions. So what did the first Pacific Standard Time accomplish? I think that it rescued an endangered archive. It presented a huge range of astonishing exhibitions based on new research. 40 new catalogs were published. Previously, there had been one real book that was on the history of LA art in this period. It created a new model of collaboration among museums, but perhaps most importantly, it rewrote the history of Los Angeles art from what we referred to as a left coast perspective. It decentered the narrative of the history of modern art internationally in these years, focusing on movements such as light and space, feminist art, and Chicano art. So it brings me to LA, the next iteration of Pacific Standard Time. And we're using this as the occasion to stage a conversation between Mari Carmen Ramírez and Guillermo Kuitca, who Mari Carmen will be a co-curator of one of the newest Pacific Standard Time exhibitions. As I said, LA will open in September 2017, and it will have a vastly different scope than the first Pacific Standard Time, because it will focus on the history of Latin American and US Latino art. The topic seemed right for Los Angeles, and when all the museum partners came together in Los Angeles, they really thought that this was the topic that we should focus on. The city of Los Angeles was actually born in 1781 as a part of a New Spain, so in some ways you could argue that we're a Latin American city of long standing. And nearly half the population of Los Angeles today has its roots in Latin America. Once again, we use this model that the Getty supported 2 years of research and planning for all the museums throughout Southern California, who all came with their own exhibition projects. This was not a top-down model where the Getty somehow told people what to do, but it was each of the museums pursuing their own passion projects. And they formed research teams that involved scholars and curators from throughout the Americas, many of them from here in Brazil. And there were probably more than 200 scholars and curators who were involved in the research leading up to these exhibitions that will open in 2017. Last week, we actually announced the second phase of these grants to implement, to put on these exhibitions and for the catalogs. And thus far, the Getty Foundation has invested almost $14 million in this project. And it will go up a little from there as well before we're finished. There will eventually be some 70 exhibitions. We've funded about 45 of them so far. And these will range from Santa Barbara in the north of Los Angeles down to San Diego, and from Santa Monica out to Palm Springs. And they will all happen over a 4-month period. We will once again have a performance art festival, and all the galleries will participate once again, so there will probably be another 100 gallery shows added to this lineup. I wish I could tell you about all 40-something exhibitions that are already in development, but I really want to leave time for Mari Carmen and Guillermo to be in conversation, so I will resist doing that. Instead, I'm going to tell you just very, very briefly mention 7 of the exhibitions that actually have a connection to Brazil. The first is an exhibition that will be at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles and will feature the work of some 90 women artists from 15 countries, primarily in South America. And it was a period of extraordinary conceptual and aesthetic experimentation when women artists created pioneering works, often under conditions that was difficult under the military dictatorships. There are, of course, some of the well-known women artists, such as Ligia Clark or Ligia Pape, but there are a whole host of artists who have gone under-recognized in recent decades and whose important contributions will be brought back to life in this exhibition. We also have an exhibition that is a collaboration between the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego and the Jumex Museum in Mexico City and the Museo de Arte de Lima in Peru. It is going to look at the ways that Latin American artists between the 1960s and the 1980s responded to the unraveling of the promise of modernization after World War II in South America, primarily in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela. This was a period, of course, in which artists under the dictatorships often were prevented from working in the institutional art world and sought new ways to connect directly with publics, often working with communities and using strategies from film, theater, and architecture in their work. One of my favorite projects actually is a collaboration between one of our largest institutional partners and one of our smallest. LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and 18th Street Art Center. And it is going to present the work of a younger generation of Latin American and US Latino artists. Many of the artists involved in this project have come to Los Angeles for residencies at 18th Street Art Center, where they've begun to develop site-specific works that will be seen at various venues throughout the city of Los Angeles and on the LACMA campus. We're also going to have a number of single artist shows. There'll be lots of surveys looking at multiple countries, but there'll also be some monographic shows. And one of them will be of the Brazilian artist Ana Maria Maiolino, and this will be a career retrospective leading up to her contemporary work, her current work, that will be at the Museum of Contemporary Art, MoCA. We'll also have a mid-career retrospective of the Brazilian-born Valesca Suarez, who now lives in New York, and this will be at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. And I, of course, have to mention one of the 4 exhibitions that will take place at the Getty, and really gives you a sense of the kind of serious research that goes into these exhibitions. It's a collaboration with scientific research centers in Buenos Aires and in Belo Horizonte, where they're studying the materiality of concrete art in Brazil and Argentina in the 1940s and 1950s. It's geometric abstraction. And they're actually trying to figure out what were the paints and what were the surfaces in which these works were made. And it will actually tell us a lot about the artistic intent that went into the manufacture of these works, what the artists were thinking, how they were trying to use the materials, and equally important, it will really help with the conservation of these materials because we really don't know exactly what they were made of. There's a lot of speculation that industrial paints were used, but that doesn't seem to be always the case. Difference between Argentina and Brazil. And something that my colleague Andrew is always pointing out, it was really interesting at the Leisure Clark retrospective at MoMA. There were 5 works, early works, all clearly done around the same time. And the labels had them listed as 5 different materials, including acrylic, which had not yet been invented. So it shows you how little we actually know about these materials. There's also going to be an exhibition of the works of Afro-Brazilian artists from Bahia, and some of the traditional artists you may be familiar with, but bringing it up to contemporary times. And this really is going to be an investigation into the history of race in Brazil, which we think will also be an important contribution to this suite of exhibitions of Pacific Standard Time. And this one is going to take place at one of the university museums at the University of California, Los Angeles. So I invite you all to join us in September 2017 when all these exhibitions will open. The Performance Art Festival will be in January 2018, so you'll need to come back for a second trip. And we will have a VIP program that will open Pacific Standard Time, and it will be a fantastic party, I promise. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Mari Carmen Ramírez and Guillermo Kuitca. Mari Carmen is the co-curator of one of the exhibitions that will take place at LACMA, and she is the Wortham Curator of Latin American Art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston and director of the International Center for the Art of the Americas. She's also been a very valuable advisor and collaborator on Pacific Standard Time and a friend of very long standing, so it's a delight to have her here. It's also really, really wonderful to introduce Guillermo, who probably doesn't need much introduction to any of you. He's a leading international artist who's had an incredible presence in recent years. I'll just mention a few of his breakthrough moments early on, representing Argentina in the 18th Sao Paulo Biennial, his selection for a project show at MoMA, and of course the acclaimed 1992 installation at Documenta 9, which so many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with. What's going to happen is they're going to come up here. Mari Carmen's going to talk a little bit about the show that she's co-curating and that Guillermo will have an important piece in, and open that out into a discussion of what we're trying to accomplish in Pacific Standard Time.
Por gentileza, convido então Guilherme e Mari Carmen, por gentileza.
Is it working? Now. Okay. Boa tarde. De novo. I was here yesterday, and as I explained, my Portuguese is very bad, so I'm going to speak in English. I want to express my thanks to Arte Brasileiros and SP-Arte for inviting, making possible this conversation. Also to the Getty Foundation, and particularly to Joan Weinstein for the possibility to be here today to talk about this exhibition, and particularly to engage with Guillermo Kuitca, who's a much admired artist and friend, and someone that I enjoy immensely to have conversations with. So, so hopefully we will go to another stage of conversing about art topics. I'm going to be presenting to you this exhibition that I am co-curating in the context of Pacific Standard Time. It is an exhibition called Home, So Different, So Appealing, and it is a collaboration between the Los Angeles County Museum, or LACMA, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and the UCLA Chicano Research Studies Center. The project was conceived in the context of this Pacific Standard Time event, mega event, and it was proposed initially by Chon Noriega, who's the director of the UCLA Chicano Studies Center, and who is one of the co-curators of the exhibition. And the other co-curator is Pilar Tompkins Rivas, from a curator from LACMA. And so the three of us have been working together for the last 2.5 years, putting together and organizing, articulating, this project. The exhibition is going to bring together approximately 85 to 90 works by 40 Latin American and Latino artists. And it is an investigation of the universal notion of home, viewed from the perspective of Latin American and Latino artists. And before I go on to talk about the exhibition, I want to just detain myself for a few moments to talk about these two categories of Latin American and Latino, because this is one of the outstanding features both of Pacific Standard Time as well as of this exhibition. As I think I mentioned yesterday, Latin American art, we're all much more familiar with. It is a very, very complex field. When we talk about Latin American art, we're talking about the art of 18 to 20 countries south of the Rio Grande, a very complex geopolitical enclave that has hundreds of ethnicities, hundreds of diverse nationalities, hundreds of different histories, but that all of these histories share some commonalities in terms of colonial history. They share commonalities in terms of language and as well as religion. And so for most of the 20th century, we have been dealing with this category of Latin American art, which we understand is a very problematic category, but it is what we call an operative construct, which means that we are looking at the field in general, and we're trying to look at the similarities, the differences between these countries and between artists working in this region. And then when we talk about Latino art, we're talking about artists of Latin American descent who live and work in the United States. And so what we have seen in the context of Latino art is that initially, way back in the 1950s and 60s, we have a series of groups that include Chicano artists, or artists of Mexican and American descent. It includes Puerto Ricans and Nuyorican. Nuyorican are Puerto Ricans who moved to New York in the 1930s and 40s, and they are known through that term. It includes Cuban Americans, primarily. Those were the three major groups that at one point articulated this notion of Latino art. But over the last 20, 30 years, we have seen an extreme diversification of these Latino groups in the United States as a result of immigrations from all over Latin America, including Central America, the Caribbean, South America. And so what we have right now is a very, very complex phenomenon of artists who claim some kind of Latin American or Latino descent. It's important to bear in mind that in the case of Chicano artists, for instance, some of these artists claim descent all the way back, to almost the period before Anglos, where had come to the United States. So this was a period when parts of California and New Mexico were in Spanish hands. And so they have a very, very long lineage in the United States. And then there are other of these artists who, communities that have arrived later, but who have a long trajectory in the United States. And many of them participated of the civil rights movement, and so they have a long history politically in the United States. As of today, as I mentioned yesterday, there are 52 million Latinos in the United States. It's 17% of the population. And just to give you an idea in relative terms what that means is that in terms of population, the United States would be the second Spanish-speaking country in the world after Mexico. Okay, so that is what we're dealing with in these terms. This is not just about some communities of working class people that went to the United States. This is a very complex phenomenon that is in the process of transforming the United States from the inside, and is having, as we all know by now, a very significant impact in the political process, and will continue to have it, for the next few decades. So. For many of us who are in the Latin American field, we feel that dealing with what I call the Latino factor is a very urgent task. I mean, we really need to start focusing on what is happening to all of these artists in the United States. How are they interacting with artists from the US, with artists from other places in Latin America, and how are they interacting with artists in Mexico, Central, South America, and the Caribbean. This is, I believe, a very urgent task, and the project that I showed yesterday, the archive project, the ICAA documents project, is precisely one of the first projects that attempts to bring together these two groups and to try to figure out, what their affinities, commonalities are through the documents themselves, through the primary sources. So this exhibition follows in those efforts, and it's one of the few exhibitions that have attempted to really look at this phenomenon of Latin American and Latino art. A precedent for this show would be the exhibition called Ante-América, which was curated by Gerardo Mosquera and Carolina Ponce de Leon way back in 1992. It initiated in Colombia and then went to the United States. And so this is since then, there really hasn't been any major exhibitions sponsored by major museums in the United States that have focused on this subject. So the exhibition is focusing on the idea of home, which is, of course, a very universal concept. It is one of the basic conditions of human existence, to have a home. And so it is, you can claim, a topic that has existed, forever. However, this is not a topic that we imposed, on the notion of Latino and Latin American art. When we started out looking for a project to propose for Pacific Standard Time, we reviewed hundreds of artists, a very long list of artists from both sides, and we realized that one of the unifying threads of the most interesting work that we found at that time was this idea of home. So this notion is coming from the work itself, from the production of these artists, and from our trying to understand what this concept means for both Latin American and Latino artists. The exhibition, as I said, brings together about 85 works, about 40 artists, and it involves a very broad range of media, from painting, sculpture, video, installations, interactive works, objects, everything, works on paper, everything is represented in the exhibition. The majority of the artists are artists who have been active since 1950. So we are covering a broad terrain, 1950 all the way to the contemporary period. But of course, it is important to bear in mind that the exhibition is not a survey. It does not pretend to tell a history of all these artists or this art. And so in order to cover this very broad and a spectrum of production, we resorted to the constellation model, which Hector Alea and I introduced when we did the exhibition Inverted Utopias in 2004. And it is a very flexible model that allows you to show the work of artists that are from different generations, they are from different periods, different countries, different traditions. These works can come together in the exhibition space around a set of tensions or around one particular idea. Sometimes that idea has to do with affinities, formal affinities between the works. Sometimes it has to do with ideological affinities. Sometimes it has to do with tensions and oppositions, between the works. But the idea is that you are taking works that are paradigmatic of a particular theme, and you're putting them in dialogue with each other, and the works actually condense, broader movements, broader tendencies, related to this art or to that particular period. And so they are sort of like luminous points, that help you understand, the phenomenon, at stake. And so that's what we're trying to do in this exhibition. And what I want to do now is just take you through some of these constellations that we have come up with and have a look at the work and how artists are dealing with this idea of home. What we wanted to do was to look at the different iterations of home from the domestic space all the way to the homeland, because it's such a broad and fascinating concept. And as I said, there's so many artists working in this vein right now. So the exhibition will start with the idea of model homes. The idea, the ideal home that is very much predicated, both in the United States and Latin America, on the notion of the American dream and the house of the American dream. And it is a notion that is very much also linked to the idea of consumerism and to consumer culture. It's what people think about when they think of making the United States their home. Now, there are two works that really stimulated our thinking about this idea of home. And the first one is by the Colombian artist Miguel Ángel Rojas. And it's a work that gives the title to the exhibition, just what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing. What he's doing in this work, he's quoting the work of the 1960s by the British pop artist Richard Hamilton, who was one of the first artists to introduce pop art, and who was, in his own way, making reference to the idea of the excesses of American consumerism. So Miguel Ángel Rojas takes that, he appropriates that line, and he gives it his own twist. The work is made by little dots, which are punched out holes, punched out dots made out of coca leaves, which is the raw material of cocaine. And so the work has this kind of very subversive meaning, because it's saying, what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing? So it is drug consumption, cocaine, and drug trafficking, which is an essential part of our contemporary culture. The other work is a work by Daniel Joseph Martinez, a Chicano artist based in LA, one of the major artists of the Latino movement. And in this case, it is a model home. It is a scale version of the house of the so-called Unabomber, Thomas Kuczynski, who was this guy who exploded a major federal building in Oklahoma a few years ago and was kind of an eccentric fundamentalist. And he's done a scale model of the house of the Unabomber, and he's painted it with the colors of Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart, the icon of, modern living, and who was also imprisoned for fraud. So these are all works that are alluding to the corruption, that is implicit in this idea of the American dream. Salomon Huerta, a young Chicano artist from LA, with a series of paintings that depict, the ideal of middle-class homes in LA, but also in the United States. They are works that are traditional painting in different chromatic configurations, but they all allude to this idea of the American home, the American house. These are all works that will be in dialogue. They will be part of the first constellation. And you can see up there a series of photographs by Livia Corona Benjamin, which is part of a series called 47,547 Homes. This is an artist who works with photography and has been documenting the developments in the border. These are homes that are made, that have been made in the Tijuana or in the state of Mexico, close to the border, and they are usually these thousands and thousands and thousands of houses, all the same, made by Mexican or American developers, many times who are benefiting from funds that come out of corruption, from local governments. And so she's alluding to that phenomenon of the massification of this idea of the home. And then Andres Asturias is also working with photography, documenting the impact of the so-called remesas, which are the money that the immigrants send back to their homes. And this money is helping people in their local communities to rebuild their homes. But in this case, it has also produced a very interesting phenomenon, and it's that they proceed to decorate their homes with commercial logos or with things like the American flag. And so there is this new type of facades, that are, some of them, in this case, is the American flag, but in other cases, the entire facade of the house has been painted, for instance, with the logo of Nike, the sports, or, Coca-Cola or something of that sort. So this is a very interesting phenomenon of hybridization. But what is also interesting and what we also value about this work is that this is not just a very literal or explicit representation of these subject matter, but also done in a way that is playing with the formal aspects of the work. And so this is, again, Livia Corona Benjamin. I mean, this looks almost like a geometric painting, but this is all the backyards and how they butt against one another. But the way that the angle in which she's doing it is also very suggestive and very stimulating from a formal point of view. The work of Luis Benedit, an Argentinian artist who emerged in the 1960s and who he was an architect by training, and he has a whole series of works which are ranchos, the type of buildings that you find in the homes that you find in the countryside, and they are all made with materials that relate to the local economy and the local economy in Argentina. So, for instance, sugar cube, this is plexiglass and wood and sugar, and in the other case is wool taken from sheep, local sheep. So these are all, they were works done in the 1990s, but that are also referring to particular themes of Argentinian society at that time, particularly the relationship between the countryside and the city and local economies. Then we go on to another constellation, which is called the archaeology of home. And this is basically a dialogue between two major artists. One of them is Doris Salcedo, whom you're probably very familiar with. This is the series of Las Casas Viudas, and which consists of furniture that she takes from local homes in Bogota. It's recycled furniture, and then she fills it up with cement. And this is obviously, Doris's work is involved with issues of violence and civil society. And this is a very powerful statement about how the life of the home, of that particular family, has been killed, by the violence, and that has been affecting Colombian society for more than 4 or 5 decades by now. So it is a very powerful statement. And then on the other hand is Rafael Montañez Ortiz, a Nuyorican artist working in New York, who since the 1960s was involved with the idea of he would take furniture pieces and he would destroy them through performative acts. And he would, in that way, he was doing a version of destructive art based on performance, but then producing these kinds of archaeological relics, of middle-class homes. The notion of recycling is very powerful amongst all of these artists, beginning with Antonio Berni from Argentina, an artist who played a very major role in the whole notion of assemblage since the 1960s. He was taking, in order to tell the story of Juanito Laguna, a boy from the shanty towns of Buenos Aires, he decided that instead of painting it, he would take materials from the shanty town, from his environment, and he would just adhere them to wood or to the canvas, thereby creating a very powerful medium to tell the story of poverty and underdevelopment in Argentina, as well as all of Latin America. Joana Calle from Colombia is an artist who also uses recycling in the sense of, in this case, she's using what you see here as lines are not drawn or painted lines. They are, it's actually chicken wire. It's the kind of wires that you find with chickens and hens that protect, that corral, and also that are used to fence off people and neighbors in shanty towns. So she's using a very local material, very precarious material, completely unartistic material to render these houses that are taken from the shantytown, images that are taken from the shantytown, and she combines them with the legs and feet of children, particularly girls, who she claims are the victims of these underdevelopment and poverty. It's kind of a circular system in which these kids cannot escape. And then Camilo Ontiveros, an artist from Mexico who works in LA. He creates these sculptures out of his own, out of all of his household objects that he used to move, from Mexico to LA. And this is a very common image when you go in the road, in the highway between Mexico and LA, and you find all of these trucks with people have piled up all of their household belongings. And so this is a very powerful metaphor for the idea of immigration from Mexico into the US. Abraham Cruz Villegas, a major artist from Mexico City, also working with the idea of recycling and recycling of his own home. In this case, he works with the notion of autoconstrucción or self-construction. This refers to the idea in many of these working class families, once they are able to buy a home, they are constantly improving their home. They're constantly trying to build and rebuild their home to make it as ideal as they can. And this is a process that takes years and decades. And so it's a self-construction, which has to do with that idea of constantly building, but also identity, construction of the identity of these groups. And then Jorge Pedro Núñez from Venezuela, an artist who intervenes with collage, images taken from magazines of beautiful landscapes, and the notion of landscape is something that identifies Latin America. It's one of the markers of identity in Latin America, and then he intervenes them with this idea of the shanty towns, so that this idyllic view of Latin America, is really riddled with poverty, with underdevelopment, and many other issues that verge on inequality. Then, of course, there's a number of artists who work with the idea of home as a formal element. And, of course, the leader in this was Gordon Matta Clark, the Chilean Nuyorican artist. This is a work from 1974 in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, where he's literally taking down elements from an actual building, and he's using them, to intervene the gallery space. He's using them as pictorial as well as sculptural elements, and as well as a critique of painting and sculpture. Then this is paired with a work by a Latina artist from LA, Carmen Argote, where she has taken the entire carpet from the apartment where she grew up in LA, a very small apartment where she grew up with her whole family. And she's using this as a formal element. She's, raising the living room part almost as a painting, and then, the rest falls down on the floor. So she creates an object that is between painting and sculpture out of this carpet, which has all of the experiences imprinted, all of the life experiences of this family imprinted on its surface. And then Leila Cárdenas from Colombia, also working in the tradition of Gordon Matta Clark and making interventions in the gallery space that relate to architecture and to ruins. And then finally, Gabriel de la Mora from Mexico City. These look like paintings, as if they were paintings from the 1950s and 60s, but they are actually ceilings taken from old houses in Colonia Roma, one of the oldest elite neighborhoods in Mexico City. So that, again, he's taken all of these ceilings and turned them into a work of art. The ceilings carry the energy of the people who lived in these houses, these homes. And then the idea of mapping is also very strong, beginning with Guillermo, who will be speaking to us about how his work relates to this idea of home. The idea of the house plan with the teardrops is a very, very powerful image that we're using in this constellation. We're establishing a dialogue with Luis Kamnitzer, the conceptual artist from Uruguay, who did a very paradigmatic work of 1968 called Living Room, where he literally creates a living room with words. And these are just labels, stickers that he puts on the floor. And it's a way in which he subverts the tradition or the language of conceptualism as proposed by people like Joseph Kosuth. And he's subverting it to really, rather than being a tautology or something that has no meaning, he's giving it meaning by delineating, the living quarters of a family in Latin America. Leon Ferrari, someone that you are obviously very familiar with, also very much of a pioneer in this idea of mapping homes. This is a bairro. This is part of the cyanotypes that he did while living in Sao Paulo. And it's the idea of an entire neighborhood, that he does using letraset and heliographic printing. And of course, Guillermo's key work, Le Sacre, which is 54 beds that have maps imprinted on them. And I will not dwell on that because he will be speaking about that at length. Also in dialogue with Francis Alice, a series of paintings from the Continent series, which are very interesting to us because they not only bring the idea of continents together and the migrations of people from one to the other, but this idea of the maid who's vacuuming, and is a very powerful symbol of immigration. And we will see other works that relate to this image. Marilena Gonzalez Gonzalez. This is an outdoor work that is sort of like a magic carpet. She's an artist who had to immigrate with her family from Cuba, and this is a carpet that she creates so that children like herself, who are the children of immigrants, can dream about the home that they left behind. So it has to do with the idea of longing and dreams. Then another section that has to do with the idea of home as body or the domestic space, mostly centered on women and how women see themselves at home. In this case, this is a series of collages by Ramiro Gomez, an artist from LA of Mexican descent, where he has intervened also, images of taken from magazines that depict very upscale homes in LA, such as Beverly Hills, with the image of the maids that are usually of Latino origin, waiting to be paid or just staring at the home environment that is not theirs. The work of Beatriz Gonzalez from Colombia, a major artist from the 60s, with this idea of the vanity, which is the woman's, one of the woman's most private spaces. In this case, she's turned the vanity into, has appropriated a painting from Raphael, mother and child from Raphael, and so the woman is looking into that tradition of art. Teresa Serrano with Boca de Tabla. Teresa Serrano is one of the foremost Mexican women artists, very much concerned with issues of the abuse of women and the issues that women have to go through in their relationships. And this is a video that takes place in an old house in Mexico City, where the woman spends the entire video just walking through the house, looking at herself in the mirror. And so it's sort of like a metaphor for women. Mirna Baez from Puerto Rico, again, the idea of a woman looking into the vanity, into the mirror, but in this case also seeing the countryside of Puerto Rico. It's a work that has a lot of resonance with issues of identity in Puerto Rico. Nicola Costantino with Evita Perón, again looking at herself in the mirror and fixing her up. In this case, a very powerful symbol of Argentinian identity, as well as a very powerful symbol for women in general. And then the idea of troubled homes. This is where home intervenes in terms of the homeland. And we have the work of Alore Calzadilla, Puerto Rican artist, very well known in the international circuits. This is a work in which they make reference to the invasion or the control of the island of Vieques by the US Navy. This is an island off the shore of Puerto Rico. And they are doing an act of civil disobedience because they go out, they turn their dining room table into a powered motorboat, and they go around the island of Vieques in an act of civil disobedience. And so the video tracks down that process and makes reference to this, to the issue of Puerto Rico as a colonial enclave. Vincent Valdez from San Antonio, an artist who's receiving a lot of attention right now, with the idea of the soldiers who have died, in all of the wars that the United States has been involved with in the last few years, and the idea of bringing home the coffin. Pepón Osorio with a major installation that consists of, it's called Badge of Honor, and it has on one side the room of a teenage boy living in the Bronx, and on the other side the prison cell of his father. And the father and son speak to each other through the videos on each wall. And then Jessica Caire from Guatemala is a video where she turns fruits, tropical fruits from her home into weapons as a sort of like critique of US intervention and US imperialism, as well as issues that involve violence in her countries. Juan Sanchez, also from Puerto Rico and New York, alluding to the issues of Puerto Rican identity. Where is my country? And basically, that gives you a sense of what some of the works in the exhibition art. But ultimately, I wanted to end with this work, which is not in the exhibition, but will probably be in the catalog, which Franklin Sermons showed yesterday, which is Alfredo Jar's paradigmatic work of 1987 done. He did it at Madison Square Garden, where he projected this huge billboard, light billboard that says, "This is not America," and "This is America." So it's the conjoining of both North and South. And so this exhibition is a provocation, like many exhibitions. It aims to provoke a reflection, not only about this idea of home and how artists have engaged it throughout in the last 5 or 6 decades, but also on the relationship between the two Americas, the North and the South, that have been, that are so close, but at the same time so apart. And the idea that Latin America and Latino USA need to come together in a dialogue, as I said before, is an urgent task. And the exhibition hopes to provoke the continuation of that dialogue. Thank you.
Hi, how are you? So, should we want to exchange some ideas in that, or want to go to and look some of my works first?
Okay, well,
Yeah.
however you want.
Yeah, I would just add some ideas that, but since obviously there's in so many research, knowledge collections, I mean, so many things happening since, and you have to do so much in many of that, and playing a little bit with the title of your show, Home, I wonder that if today we are not almost start to talk about the home of the Latin American art is the U.S. and how problematic that might be, and how ironic. And even if you, at the end, when you see Alfredo Jar's logo, you understand that, oh, okay, this is not America. Of course, there are, that means a lot of things. But I wonder how you see the fact that the home of the Latin American art seems to be today the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah. I think that certainly the representation of Latin American art is something that has been taking place in the United States since the 1940s. Mm-hmm. And I think when we talk about this issue of Latin American art, we need to recognize that the whole notion of bringing together art from all the different countries in Latin America and representing them, showing them, displaying them in exhibitions or in museum collections is an idea that is born in the United States. This is not something that was born in the individual countries. I mean, you go to Argentina, and with the exception of Malba and the Colección Costantini, which is a museum of Latin American art, you see basically Argentinian art. You go to Mexico and you see Mexican art, or you go to Colombia and you see Colombian art. But the idea of gathering all these countries, the art of all of these countries together, is something that was born in the United States, particularly during the period of Alfred Barr at the Museum of Modern Art. So there is already a tradition there, and also the fact that the United States is the center for the validation at the level of market value of this art. It's the center where the auctions take place, which are Latin American auctions, and have been in place since 1979. And of course, there's a very big network and a very big circuit at both the academic and museum and collector level. So in that sense, yes.
There are good reasons. I mean, I'm totally, what I'm saying, I believe what I'm saying, and I agree with you. There are good reasons for this to happen, but I just see that there is some, I don't know, some contradiction, at least on this statement. I've been alert that I had to probably start to show my work, so please jump in and we could keep talking while I show something. Today, when I prepared a lot of a very reduced PowerPoint of some of the works of mine that are connected to the subjects of home, I pressed one key and it was not intentional. So the quotation, the question mark came as a totally random. But when I saw it, I thought it was a way to question everything that we are talking this to now. This is an early work from '82, and of course this depicts a bed. And while I was hearing Mari Carmen talking, I feel how much also I could see within my work this process from the private, domestic aspects and to the homeland. So in a way that it's not only that subjects that happen, at least in my case, spread through different artists, but within my own work. And what I'll show you is a little bit of that process. There's many things happening in between, but I decided to draw this line from the domestic and private to the public. And I think the bed is almost like our first terrain, our first territory, our land. Of course, the bed is the place of the dream, sex, life, death, etc., etc. But I also like to think the bed as a platform, and I'm insisting this image because it drives. It's like a vehicle that takes pretty much. It carries pretty much many of my work. Some figures were connected to the bed, and there is this piece, also early piece from '82, and I would start to be interesting in the scale of things. So when you start to see my interest in architecture, maybe it was born not just by chance, but also by the fact that scale-wise, I was even more attracted by not only for the domestic drama that this woman will almost is about to smash her baby or something like that, but also by the fact that the figures were so tiny in comparison with these huge spaces. The same as here, where historical reference for the more cinematic history of the Potemkin battleship is playing along with sexual and religious scene in a quite theatrical way, I could say. But let me stop here. I think this is a work that connects to many of the images that Mari Carmen showed, and somehow the idea of the bed implied a room, and that room implied an apartment. So very, very quickly, one thing asked for the other. So somehow this apartment was originally, painted as a sort of a 3D and in a perspective way, and even if the house plan that I painted later had a different composition, it was somehow the same architectural unit as you would see here as well, and but at some point the house plan frozen in this. Sorry, I don't know why it goes 2 by 2, but so this house plan is for me a sort of a very prototypical, stereotypical plan of an urban middle-class family unit. So it's not only associated with an architectural prototype, but also as a sociological unit. So I see that there's, 2 rooms, probably mother, father, 1 or 2 kids, kitchen, bathroom, and what probably is common area where a TV and a bed and a living room might be. The fact that I use this figure for on and on, it allowed me to make all sorts of variations. So one thing was always staying there while the other was changing. Here the house is depicted by the title of a famous Rolling Stone song, "Give Me Shelter," but also the sense of the house as a shelter was was important to me to use to depict the house. There was also one of the category that you use by describing the home as a body, and I think we see here. Sorry, I don't know how to stop this. And so we see here like the house also becoming a body, or at least having human body parts in the depiction of the perimeter of the house. Here are bones, and this is how what I call a shit disposal house plan, and which is pretty graphic. That the house as a shitting. Actually, it's a big painting, and it's this huge piece of shit. I guess I don't know how to call it, and. Sorry, what should I say? Oh, should I say no? Yeah, okay. Go forward. And insisting on the idea of the body and the houseplant, here I see the plan as the blood flows. So in this painting is called Houseplant with Broken Heart. That one is a house plan with blood flows. So somehow the blood systems repeat or takes the shape of a house. Oh. Now, go ahead. Maybe that's where, okay, make a big leap of time, but take me a little bit backward, so I'll make, I'm not sure, is doing whatever.
It's going forward. It's going back.
Yeah, I wanted to go back, especially to, yeah, oh.
Sorry, this one.
And a previous one? Okay, we could stop here. So you see that there have been a lot of houseplants variations, and at some point I came across with this idea that coming and coming home, but also playing with the idea of coming to in the sexual meaning of coming, but also the idea to arriving. So this image is a way echoing a Gilbert and George work, which says coming, and it has all this sort of ejaculation, which I totally exaggerate in my work. So there is this idea that it has been like a huge ejaculation over the work, but also over parts of a house and the apartment, and also the city that contains that apartment. So it's a sort of a multiple layers of coming, and also multiple layers of habitational spaces. This took me to, the first time that I was able to show the works in this idea of home from the private to the homeland and therefore the public was in Sao Paulo, and right next door. And so these are shots from my Sao Paulo presentation at the Biennale of 1989, and which was the first time also that I showed the beds. At that time, the bed not only was a depicted object, but it was also something that started to gain volume and therefore became more like an object. Originally, there were vertical maps, vertical mattresses, where maps were painted, and at some point they became horizontal. And in this installation that started by creating these units, grew into what Mari Carmen showed rapidly, the Le Sacre, which is made out of 54 units of mattresses that depict maps from. The maps are realistic. They're real maps, but they they don't make any sense in geopolitical terms. There is no geographical area that is depicted. It's just it's quite random, and so the cartography they generate, it's hard to make sense out of the cartography in terms of geopolitical terms. So there are various images of the same piece which has very different way to be installed. Sometimes it's spread, sometimes it's compact, like in this case. It was vertical once and twice. Or it created sort of a padded room. So I think that in the genesis of this project was this little drawing that I had with a house that is also padded all around, as this sort of a classic image of the, the crazy people confined in a room where they cannot crash their head against the walls because the walls are soft. So in a way, this also, for me, echoing that idea that I had for the house. This is another coming painting. Maps were always something I was very interesting in. At some point, the maps that I depicted were not any longer city plans, but huge areas that they were totally unreadable, or they were only readable when you were so close that you have like almost pressing your head against the work, but from a distance they're more related to a sort of a neurological circuit rather than a real information map. This is what we saw before was a detail of this painting. I will make a little short cut to some of my theatrical work that in particular I like very much. This work has a very theatrical imprint or intention. And in 2003, I was invited to do a stage set for Garcia Lorca's La Casa de Bernarda Alba, the house of Bernarda Alba. And I'm not a stage designer. I'm interested in sometimes theater works, but I thought about this work as more like a theatrical installation or a device that serves the director to place. But I found that again, the house of Bernarda Alba is a tragedy that it could be, have the accent on the characters, whether it's Bernarda Alba or her daughters. But actually, in the title itself, the house was present. So I wanted to put the house in a way as some kind of to put the accent on the idea of a house. Obviously it's a quite abstract stage, but still my idea was to serve the Garcia Lorca's drama, which is normally happening not in the rooms of the house, but in the area where the daughter and the daughters and the rest of the characters met, but we don't know much about what's happening on the rooms. So somehow the fact that I place some beds imply that the character could go to her bed and somehow make from that bed a moment that it was parallel to the scene, and therefore it was her room. And so there are other images of that stage that, it's a tragedy, so things go terribly wrong. And, so making a huge leap in time, there is this conveyor belt images that I start to work with. And I was fascinated by this object, and we all have experienced this fear in front of this stupid object, like, you know, whether my luggage will ever came. As you know, sometimes it's just a shirt, or I mean, maybe sometimes it's all what we have, sometimes it's nothing at all important. But so, because I was still somehow thinking on theaters, I replaced what is normally a rubber curtain where the luggage makes its appearance through a theatrical one. So I thought it would make it, you know, a connection for consider the conveyor belts as a stage. And I will show briefly some of my new home. My new home looks like a home we all know. This looks like a little bit like analytic, you know, cubism. Like there is ghost of Picasso and Braque, but for me there's also a lot of ghosts of Torres Garcia and Lito, and maybe the early cubism of Latin America that Diego Rivera experimented. But you know, I didn't start to paint these works because I wanted to pay a tribute to nothing in particular, but somehow I felt completely inhabited by this kind of language. And I felt that I could speak that language. And that's the language I speak today. And I found that I thought that was interesting for me today to show these images to you, because it seems like this is a home to me, the home of the painting, and somehow the place that gathered many of my pictorial alphabet. I want to present one consequences of that. It was that some of the maps that maybe 20 years before this painting used to be so geopolitical, but we don't know anymore where they are. They're just lines that, you know, they're free. Maybe they don't arrive anywhere, and they don't connect any more places. This is a quite recent take for me of the maps. Maybe in this particular painting, which I like, it's almost like this sort of language that I was mentioning right before. It was a topography, and for this very, very free and somehow lyrical maps. And the last images I will show is my real home. This is my house, and my house also inhabited by my own painting, which I thought it was also my home paintings. So in a funny way, my paintings invade my studio, and you know, they kick me out. So they became this sort of murals, and I felt very, very engaged. And now I understand that the notion of home goes really across my work. And I think the images that Mari Carmen presented make so much sense that almost the idea of home will maybe at some point, and that might be a question to you, Mari Carmen, will play along or reverse the idea of identity, which is we all feel some fatigue on the notion of identity, because it's been, you know, elaborated all along, you know, the last maybe 35 years. And this is the last image, and I just wanted to show how the artist left the studio and, you know, never returns. But anyway, I found that you said very clearly at some point that you didn't, it's because by looking at the works that you selected that the idea of home seemed to be fitting. And I wonder if you do the opposite, you know, the process in the opposite way, and thinking that home might be a valid notion and a valid, you know, concept to, you know, obviously it is for create a show, but there might be, you know, a concept that it will grow, or it will be, you know, it will have the strength to to see beyond what is now this show. I guess it might.
Thank you, Guillermo. I think
you.
that was fantastic.
That was fast.
Just to take up your last comment, I do think that what we have found out in terms of putting together this exhibition is that this is a really incredibly rich concept, and that it is incredibly rich, incredibly topical today. And yes, I think that it is a way to address issues of identity in a way that it's not, framed in the old terms of the debates of identity. So that issues of, what is your home, what does home mean today, how you build your home, how you construct your imaginary of your home, how do you negotiate between your domestic space and, the homeland.
The homeland, yeah.
And the homeland. What does the homeland mean, in relation to home? I think those are all, very valid ways of looking at issues that artists are confronting today and that they're reflecting upon in a very rich way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was wondering, and it's I think we're now in Brazil and from Argentina, and it took us a while, and maybe we still don't recognize ourselves as Latin Americans. I mean, I know I'm a Latin American, and I have no problems with that, and but still there is a sense of that category, the Latin American art. It has to cover, a complexity, which of course you mentioned, and you're more than aware of that. That I mean, how I wonder, and especially when I saw the incredible scope when Joan was making her introduction, what would be the outcome of this? I mean, this hundreds of exhibitions actually, and whether we will see ourselves or the United States will see Latin America as a more complex. I mean, we will gain in complexity. We will go back to understand that Brazil has one certain characteristics, and in Argentina some others, and so on. And I think as more as we know more about ourselves, we cannot. So we go in the opposite direction. We don't merge because we know our differences, and so in a way it creates subcategories within a large category. Anyway, those are probably thoughts that might have to be thought after the LA project. It's over, and but I really look forward for that, and hoping that the scholars and critics will keep thinking without giving for granted that is the starting point. It might not be a valid starting point at all. So I don't know, just my reflection.
No, we all agree with that, and I don't think anybody wants to establish that as either the starting. It's the starting point, but not the end. The end result. I think, if anything, what these mega event that Joan has been articulating and organizing in the Getty, in a way, it's going to allow people to see the complexity, of the art produced in this region, as well as they're going to be able to really go into more depth, because of the research that has been put into motion here for each one of these exhibitions. So hopefully it will provide depth, to what we know about Latin American art without necessarily creating, a homogeneous, version of that, and without forcing any other categories except to see the contradictions, that are embedded, in the region itself. Because certainly it's a region that, on the one hand, yes, it is made up of all these individual nations who have their individual histories. But what we have also argued in the past And I worked together, and I worked on a very big book. It was about 1,500 pages of tracking, this idea of Latin America and Latino art and all its contradictions. And, there has been always, from the beginnings, a utopian desire, for thinking of Latin America as a whole.
Yeah, but that utopian desire comes from where? I mean, because I don't think we as a Latin American have that utopian desire.
No, it does. It comes from Latin Americans. It comes from the
Yes,
tradition of intellectuals and pensadores, the so-called pensadores and intellectuals from Latin America, from the beginning, from José Vasconcelos, Alfonso Reyes. I mean, Sarmiento. This is a very ingrained way of thinking about Latin America, sort of like in unity, there is strength. And I think that, it's operating on an individual basis, but also, trying to build some kind of imaginary, self-concocted imaginary, for the region. Yeah.
Thank you. The Latin American art was a different utopia rather than, Simón Bolívar or something
no, of
might
course.
have thought.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I said it in that sense, of course. In the sense that you said, it's of course it's could be a big, a big project.